Hey, AP Euro. I'm going to try to give a quick overview of the English Civil War and Glorious Revolution. Okay, this is how I think of it. So I'm going to go back to this page that is the notes on absolutism. And so we've got 1618 to 1648, 30 Years' War. That information from the last video. You've got English's Glorious Revolution. Charles I executed to the Glorious Revolution. Those are the two dates that I remember. And then you have the monarch Louis XIV that has to do with absolutism in France, and Peter the Great of absolutism in Russia. And this is how I think about this absolutism chapter of these different major events: the 30 Years' War, England's Civil War and Glorious Revolution, and then absolutism of Louis XIV and Peter the Great, and how they all are overlapping each other. And remember the other things that are overlapping: the scientific revolution is going on, the Enlightenment is going on, global commerce is going on with the triangle trade and slavery and plantation agriculture and cash crops. And you're going to have the French Revolution in this area too. And so this is period 2. And so I'm going to take you through how I think of Charles I executed Glorious Revolution. So the way I think of this is, I think you have Charles I executed. That is a sort of an important feature. And so from there, where do I go? I know that before Charles I is executed, there's civil war. And the civil war in England is happening, but basically between the king versus Parliament. And that really is how, because this gets really complicated, but if you're able to just think of king versus Parliament about civil war through the Glorious Revolution, it's going to help, okay? And so... let's see. Okay, you have the Civil War. Why do you have a Civil War in England? This is due to Charles I raising taxes, and this is typical of the of most revolutions. Raises taxes, and when you think of absolute monarchs, again, think about this word consent. Raises taxes without consent from Parliament. And even though we've had absolutist rulers in England, Charles I wasn't very popular. Think back to the last popular monarch in England. It was Elizabeth I. And the date I always associate with her is 1688, because that's the Spanish Armada, when England defeats Spain. But after her, because she's the Virgin Queen, she can't pass on her lineage, her dynasty. And so this is the end of the Tudor dynasty. And then the Stuarts come in, and James I comes down from Scotland and becomes king. These are called the Stuarts. And then after James I, it's basically a James and Charles sandwich that happens in this time. You've got James, and then Charles I. He's the one who gets his head cut off. He's raising taxes without consent, and also you've got religious issues. Remember how Elizabeth I was a politique? She's a politique with it in the Church of England. And she's balancing between, you've got Catholics, and you've also got Puritans, who are, that's another name for Calvinists. And so James I and Charles I also can't balance these religious differences. And Charles I and his family are... even though they're the head of the Church of England, they're also they're seen as being sympathetic to the Catholics. And then Parliament is made up of many Puritans. And so this war is also, there are religious elements to it, where you have, even though it's king versus Parliament, It's also Catholic sympathizers versus Puritan sympathizers. And so after this civil war, Charles I is executed, and the person who was the leader of Parliament, who's a Puritan, was Oliver Cromwell. And then Oliver Cromwell becomes the leader of England. And he is a Puritan. And think back to all those Puritan rules that were in Geneva. And Oliver Cromwell is going to make Puritan laws also. He makes England not a very fun place to be, where there's no more sports, there's no more theater. And think about the great theater. I mean, this is a place of Shakespeare. It gets closed down, so there are Puritan laws. And he also has a series of victories. He crushes Ireland and Scotland. He's very warlike. And also he fights against the Dutch. There are these Anglo-Dutch wars. And so this is England getting supremacy. And this is a time without a king. Oliver Cromwell, you could say he basically rules as a dictator. Even though he says it's a republic, it's not. And so this is the period of Oliver Cromwell. After Cromwell dies, Charles II's son is invited back. And this is called the restoration of the monarchy. Charles II. And this is the restoration. But again, there are these issues between Catholics and Protestants that bubble to the surface. And let's see, how do I remember this? Oh yeah, it's a sandwich. So it's like you've got James up here. There's a James, there's a Charles. Cromwell's the meat in the middle. So James, Charles, Cromwell. And then there's another Charles on this side and another James on this side too. There's a James who comes to power after Cromwell, James II. And then after this, there's a secret deal that James II is trying to make with Louis XIV that say that he's going to make England Catholic again. And so at this point, there is a what's called the Glorious Revolution. Glorious Rev. And this is in 1688. I'm sorry, I screwed up. You know, up here I said 1688 was Elizabeth. Sorry, that's 1588. Yeah, 1588 to 1688. 1588 is Elizabeth, head of the beating the Spanish at the Spanish Armada. 1688 is the Glorious Revolution. And the date I remember in between 1588 and 1688 is 1649, which is when Charles I is executed. 1649. Okay. The Glorious Revolution in 1688, Glorious Revolution in 1688 is when finally this king versus parliament conflict that has been happening. Parliament, I'm just going to make greater than king, okay? The king agrees to share power with parliament. And so this is what becomes called a constitutional monarchy. So king needs parliament's consent, all right? And so this becomes a constitutional monarchy. This does not mean, of course, that there is equality of any sort or democracy. The people who are in parliament are very wealthy. They're nobles and wealthy landowners. And so think of this as the nobility and the bourgeoisie having control over the king. But by no means are the people of England have democracy in the way we would think of it today. Okay? And the people, James II leaves, and the monarchs who are invited to rule in his place are William and Mary. William and Mary. And he's known as William of Orange. He's from the Netherlands, the Dutch. Any of the Dutch leaders during this time, just say William of Orange, and there are many William of Oranges, and it's probably going to be right. So William and Mary are the king and queen who agree to have Parliament have power over them.